Hello, gang. Professor McElroy here. February 2022 section of Digital Illustration, GRA 2156. We're on to Learning Module 2. Good job so far with Learning Module 1, navigating through a couple of introductory chapters inside of your vector graphics textbook. Some cool projects in there, I think, at least some things that have some professional application that hopefully you're interested in as you kind of refresh or learn to draw using the pen tool and fills and strokes and scalable vector graphics and things like that. We're going to navigate into Learning Module 2 tonight. I'm going to open up the book real quick just to highlight a couple of the projects that I want you to specifically submit for me as you're working through chapters 3 and 4 in your book. And then I'm going to open up the graphic that we started creating last week. And I'm going to talk a little bit about effects, about textures, about creating different layered styles inside your illustration, just to kind of start pushing the envelope into the intermediate range. I would say intermediate range of Adobe Illustrator. Next week, we'll do a portrait and we'll start getting into some of that detailed work in vector graphic world, where you start getting into some more gradient mesh complex applications in the fill and stroke environment, and really start getting into that bit more realism approach to vector graphics. Tonight, we're going to deal with those 2D illustrations that we were creating last week, and we're going to start to apply baby steps, some effects and textures and different things to our drawing, just to start showing a little bit more of that texturized 3D environment inside of a 2D world, which is what Illustrator is. So let's first off just remember, be checking announcements, right? Be checking any kind of announcements that are being posted inside of our course. I actually have a QEP topic post that I have that our QEP director asked us to post for some feedback from the student body about our quality enhancement plan. It's a little survey about things that the university could do to help you as you finish or continue to navigate through your degree and go out into the real world. So if you're in this course, if you don't mind, click on that survey and take it. They're gathering some data for some different things like professional direction, career services, and things like that. So it's always good to get feedback from the students. So just be checking that as I'm posting elements for Illustrator class, for illustrations, to kind of help reinforce the skills that we're doing in our weekly lecture. I'm going to try to keep this lecture to an hour and 15 minutes, hour and a half kind of thing, so that you can spend some time working on your book assignments if you need to, or your out of book assignment or hot dog illustration. I'll show you a few things tonight that might be fun to incorporate into your illustration for your out of book. Remember, just keep working along, keep plugging along, and just let me know how you're doing in the process as we're doing our digital illustrations. So let's pop over to the learning module, and I'm going to scroll down to learning module 2. And you'll notice that we only have 2 chapter assignments in our book for this week. Chapter 3 is a bit more detailed and a bit more involved. There's more pages to it. Chapter 4 is much more compact and simple in the amount of projects and processes that you're reading or applying to. So that shouldn't be a killer for us this week. And then we're going to illustrate a book cover. It'll give me a perfect opportunity to see what subject matter you would pick for a book cover, and also start to see your style as a vector artist start to evolve, because I give you very limited parameters and let you kind of design what you want in a vector world. And hopefully that'll really kind of help you grow as you practice what you're doing in Illustrator and in the vector world or vector environment. So let's go in, and I'm going to scroll up, and I'm just going to open up the digital book real quick, just so I can highlight a couple of the projects that I want you to be navigating through here in week 2, learning module 2 in our vector basic book. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up. And I'm going to pop over to chapter 3, and you're going to notice that chapter 3 is a pretty involved, kind of lengthy chapter as far as it goes. I would consider page-wise, but a lot of it is kind of talking you through the digital art age. So I'm just going to scroll down. It talks a lot about different elements embedded in Illustrator. So I'm just going to scroll down. It talks a little bit about the brain, talks about pen to paper and the tactile experience versus the digital environment that we're drawing through. Talks a bit about sketching on paper, at least problem solving on paper, which is kind of a dead art form, the idea of a thumbnail. Many designers jump right to computer now and consider that their thumbnail environment, but there's something to be said for even a simple pencil line art, just to kind of problem solve what you want to do. It also talks about how simple graphics sometimes are just better to hop on the computer and start tinkering around with them. When it's iconography and it's simple buttons and things like that, sometimes it's just easier to hop right on the computer. You'll see simple graphics like this, like an eagle with a star inside of it. Quite honestly, that's a pretty simple thing to just hop into Illustrator and start tinkering around with, you know, just kind of drawing and creating and modify shapes and combining shapes and things like that. So your book talks a lot about that. It does go into this more caricature environment and has you trace this monster and add gradients to the monster using the pen tool and the fill tool and all that. It talks about tighten up your line artwork and kind of modifying. It actually gives you this red line as part of your art file inside of the student resource files. And then it gets you into shadowing and layering and some of the beginning of this three-dimensional world, a little bit of gradient texture and highlighting here, which you can see in the eyeball. This is a project that you should submit to me for chapter 3, is this little monster guy. It'll give you a chance to practice things like the gradient tool, getting a little bit better with the pen tool and things like that. This is a fun project that your Illustrator file, the book gives you, already gives you the layers created from the pencil drawing that this artist did, already gives you the red line and gives you the opportunity to fill and add texture to your drawing. This one here is also one that you should give to me. So the monster and this textual thing, just because it starts to teach you the application of some of these textures over the top. And the last one is this little monster guy. It gives you half of the sketch and has you replicate the other half of the sketch. It gives you half of the red line and has you reproduce it as a double red line. And then it has you filling in the shapes in black. And then they're actually using vellum, the original artist, and coloring behind it. The shapes are already there for you. You just apply the 3 shades of green and start filling this guy in. And we'll practice a little bit on transparencies and creating fill shapes and adding transparencies. This is what this is. And he has a gradient. So he has a gradient. He has separate shapes that are already redlined in the Illustrator file they provide to you, which they fill in white and add a transparency to it. And that's how you get kind of this brighter fill color for this monster. So you have 3 projects in chapter 3. Nothing major. This is another typography project. I'm actually going to show you tonight typography and talk a little bit about manipulating letters inside of Illustrator versus the pen tool of individual shapes, which is what this is, which ends up looking like this in the end. So I'm going to show you the essence of this using font and vector manipulation inside of there. And they do a nice overshape drop shadow on here to give you these basic effects. All 2-dimensional, all basic gradient, nothing over the top or overwhelming. Another little character, same style as the Frankenstein style guy, where you can see the black line, another one that's just black line. It's nice to open these up and take a look at the pen artwork shape of this. But honestly, this front fill is light brown. These side fills are dark brown, and that's what generates the 3-dimensional illustration for you. So there are some fun ones to play with, and they give you fills already in your Illustrator file. So open those up and just take a look at the kind of funkiness of these. But the top 3 are the only ones you have to give to me, because all this is a replication of the same gradient, the same fill, and the same shapes. And we're going to do that tonight as just kind of a best practice as you see how I'm doing it. So just as a recap for chapter 3, give me the guy that looks like Frankenstein here. Give me the monster. So here's the Frankenstein guy. Give me the little textual thing here, so you can play around with combined shapes and give me the little monster guy. So 3 mini projects, shouldn't take you longer than an hour and a half or so to tinker around with them. Take a look at the layers, turn on and off the layers, move the layers away from the monster, select your shapes and fill them using the monster layer that's already filled. Just get comfortable with kind of fills and gradients and shadows and kind of transparencies of layers. We're still all just in a 2D world. Next week, we'll do a portrait. Maybe we'll do Edgar Allan Poe or something like that. I kind of always thought he was funky and dark. And we'll start doing detailed hair work and some skin work where you start to see how you can get what we would call like digital painting and kind of get that more detailed texture in. Traditionally, we do a car illustration, but we use the same techniques I'm going to do next week for the portrait, just so you can kind of see more of the realism, 3-dimensional digital painting. Tonight, we're going to stay in a 2D world, but we're going to start using effects and layers and shapes to get that thing to come to life off of the paper, but still be cartoon-ish in style. So we'll go last week, baby steps pen tool. This week, 2D shapes, cartoony, but still 3-dimensional aspects. And then week 3, we'll do a digital illustration where we'll do a portrait, we'll sculpt the nose, we'll play around with the eyes, we'll start getting the detailed work of a digital painting, and you'll get to see the evolution of texture and kind of how it works. So chapter 3, 3 illustrations, not a ton. Chapter 4, I think there's only one that I really truly want to have just so that we can see. A lot of these are basic shapes. I want you to play with them, use the handles, tweak this thing a little bit as part of the reading and learning process, but not necessarily something to give back to me. These are pretty simple shapes. You're going to get the idea as we practice tonight, how to split a shape, fill it half one color, half the other. I see things in shapes. So for me, this is really natural. I could see cutting this shape into half a leaf, filling it light green, and it becomes 3D. Like my brain kind of sees things in solid tonal values, solid shapes, as if you were making a black and white copy of a photograph and you have blacks, dark grays, light grays, and whites. My brain already kind of sees in blacks, dark grays, light grays, and whites for 3-dimensional space. So that's something I'm going to kind of show you and kind of get your brain to start seeing things in, because if it can work in grayscale, it works in color, not the other way around. So if you can start training your brain for grayscale, dark shades, middle tones, and light shades, then you can work in color. Don't train your brain to work in color, because it eventually is going to have to be grayscale for some applications. So you want to make sure your color range is separated enough that you have darks, middle tones, and lights, that you don't see everything in 60% black, 50% black, 40% black, 30% black. You want to see 100% black, maybe 66 or 63%, 30%, and like 10 to 7%. You want to see things in a drastic range of tones. That way, when you illustrate and you start changing shades of colors, you get separation and you get distinction in what you're creating. So much of chapter 4 is manipulating line art, selecting individual shapes, tweaking them a little bit, filling in them in color. So not a lot here until you get to the skull. The skull is a fun project. When you turn on the layer files, you're going to see the color, the red line, and the outline. You can go ahead and separate those, drag those apart, play around. What I tell the students is drag that thing across, play around with it, fill your black and white with the color palette that is here, and play around with the texture layer that's already provided inside Illustrator. The beauty about the book is it provides this artwork all the way done for you, but gives you the individual pieces also. So go ahead and separate them, move them out of the way, and play around with refilling your black line with the colors that are selected, subtle gradients, play around with different shapes, see the difference between a light gray and a light green and a middle tone green to create this separation. Start seeing things in shapes. There's a cool video for that drawing as well that you could turn on and watch. The last one is these black and white logos. I don't really care about those. You can break them apart and see what they look like because they talk about typography. But the one I truly care about is this illustration. It gives you a chance to fill in and add a bitmap texture to your drawing, just so that you kind of get that thing going. We're going to do that as part of our process, is to start looking at textures and different things we can do. And you'll see how they work. But this is a really good project for it. I try to do in the lectures, especially when it's a 2-chapter lecture, to just do some different things that overlap so you can start to get comfortable with the process. So that's our 2-chapter assignment. So 3 projects, chapter 3, only 1 project, chapter 4, which will give us time for our out of book project this week, which is going to be our book cover. So I'm going to go back over here, go into our module section, and I'm going to go into, hold on just a quick second. Okay, gang, I'm back. All right, so chapter 2, right? Chapter 1's out of book was all about the hot dog illustration. You might actually see a few techniques that we're going to do tonight in our lecture that you might want to apply for your hot dog illustration. So just kind of keep that in your brain as we're manipulating. That's why I let students overlap the out of book assignments a little bit, because sometimes they need a little more time practicing with the pen tool before they start diving into some of their illustration work. So, all right, so the out of book project is an opportunity to do a vector-based book illustration. It's a really interesting assignment because take a look at the differences of illustration, digital illustration, as it applies to book covers. So I allow you pretty much to pick whatever book cover you want, with the only requirement that it needs the title, the author, and a vector only solution for your book cover. And some of the things we practice tonight might be something that you want to apply as kind of a technique or a trick inside of yours, but you'll automatically see there's way different styles, shadowing, gradients for 3D shapes versus very flat 2D solid. Look at the drama between this color and this color and this color. And you might also notice that this color is the same here, here, and here. And this color is the same here, 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 and here. It's a really good idea, and we'll talk a little bit about it in illustration, is that you have spots of color in different areas of your illustration so your eye follows the whole page. You don't want to put a spot of color in just one location because your eye, so let's say it's all black and white and one spot of red. The problem with the one spot of red is it never processes the black and white because your eye immediately goes to the red and never moves around the page. So you'll notice lots of little tricks where dark color is replicated down here and light color like here and here is replicated in the house at the top. It's just a way to get your eye to move around the page, unify the page by using similar spot colors around your illustration. But you'll notice these are all vector illustrations and they're completely different. So hopefully some of the techniques tonight will kind of help you. I get all kinds of different solutions for the book cover, and I really love it because it lets me get a little peek into how you like to digital illustrate, what you're leaning towards as you're learning digital illustration, and kind of your eye for color selection and kind of visual hierarchy. So it gives me a really good idea about how you're kind of evolving as an illustrator. Okay, so that covers kind of an introduction to recap of learning module 1, introduction into learning module 2. I'm going to go ahead now and I'm going to jump into my Illustrator file so that we can take a look at my little caricature that we had created last week. And all I did was make copies of her and move her over to different parts of the artboard so we can start exploring different things. I'm actually going to go in and add a new artboard. So I have one over here just so I have some different things to play with. So let's talk a little bit first and foremost. I'm actually going to start with type first, and then we're going to manipulate the illustration 4 different ways so you can kind of see different techniques for how to manipulate things. But I have an artboard with the girl and I just have 4 copies of her. And then I have the new artboard because I want to address type as a digital illustration as well, because I want to make sure that you're visualizing type as shapes and then illustrations as layers. So types as shapes and illustrations as layers. So the first thing is, and everyone, or at least most people that draw in Illustrator, right? So here's the text tool and here's my container, right? I could just take and tap it over here. And so I'm just going to type the word wolf, hold down shift, make the letters really big so we can start talking about the text tool, shapes, how to apply different techniques to shapes, and then we'll kind of take it from there. So the first thing is, let's just talk about type as a shape. So I'm just going to go in and I'm going to select something that I think would be a cool typeface for the word wolf. So let me just see, I have wolf selected. I'm scrolling through my typefaces just so I can see the different techniques of different typefaces for the, oh my goodness, somebody has downloaded so many fonts on this computer over the years. I'm like scrolling through this thing and it's like completely out of control. So let's just see, I want a scripty font because I want to just kind of show you what happens when you use a script typeface. So let's go up to, I'll just use Sign Painter just because that's a font that someone put on this computer. And we have this little shape right here. Now, remember that text in particularly Illustrator, it's tied to a typeface, right? So you're typing things out. But when you type things out, 2 things become readily apparent. One thing is it auto kerns, which means the space between the letters. And look how this isn't consistent, space between the letters. Leading, space between lines, which happens, and it's tied to the fact that it looks like it was just typed out on a digital computer, right? It's just typed out on keyboard, voila. Well, that's not the way type is handled within any digital application when it pertains to a designer creating a visual message and a digital illustration that they're going to produce for a commercial application. The very first thing they do is they create an outline of the type. The reason they create an outline for the type is because it's no longer the font and it's now a shape. The same way we visualize shapes in our little cartoon illustration here, hair, pigtail, face, shirt, skirt, leg, socks, that sort of thing, shoes, top and sole. Fonts are no different. You really should think of them in an illustration environment in the same way you would drawing a 2D illustration. Yeah, a font tells you something, gives you personality. Immediately, this becomes personal, like someone scripted it with a ink and pen tool. But if you notice, when I outline the type, it became individual shapes. So if I right click and ungroup this, you're going to notice that those 2 letters are tied together and the W and the F is not tied together, right? This is called a ligature, and this is kind of its own floating letter. So immediately, if I hold down shift, I can move these letters closer together. Now look at the dramatic change that already happens in a 2-dimensional shape when you type something out and you create an outline from it and you break it apart. You can start playing with the kerning, you can start playing with the scale of things, and you can start creating something that has foreground and background and has drama, and it isn't something that looks like it was just typed out in Instagram or on a computer or have tied to emojis. So that's the very first part of digital illustration as it relates to type that I want you to understand. So that's the very first thing. So now I've got to zoom in here because I'm going to actually personalize this type so we can start playing with the anchors, the directional anchors, the scale, the proportion, the rotation, everything that we need to do with illustrations. We also need to be aware of as it relates to fonts. So you're going to notice this is its own ligature shape. The F is another shape. So I can actually key this over and look at the difference of application when I let this thing stick out and it only barely overlaps on it. But look at the difference if I move this and I move it all the way over, how the shortness of this combines the F to the L. So the very first thing I do in digital illustration is I'm doing my illustration, but I'm also dreaming my type, because like you're out of book project, you're doing a book cover and you want the name of the book to be personalized. So the very first thing I do is I pick the appropriate typeface, the kind of visual writing style I want for my letters. I break them apart, create outlines, I ungroup them, and I start making a single shape out of all the mini shapes that make up the words and letters of my book title, my call to action, my name, whatever that big thing is. And I take it in chunks. So the very first thing I do is I figure out which ligatures and letters I can touch together and what personality I can make out of them. So I'm going to take these two things, and now the very first tool we want to explore, and it doesn't matter if we're working on an Illustrator for a character or we're working on type, is we want to get this thing merged together. So I'm going to open up the Window Pathfinder tool, right? Window Pathfinder, and I'm going to unite or merge this thing. So I'm going to unite it. Now you'll notice the leg of the L disappears because it merges into one shape. Why is that important? It's important because it unifies it, and now it gives me the potential to create textures, dimensional shapes, different things inside of it. So the very first thing I'm going to do, just so that you can see the application of it, is I'm going to add a gradient to those letters. So all I did was open up my gradient palette, which is right here, and I clicked on the default gradient swatch. And so I'm going to actually pull this out so that it's away from everything else. I'm going to pull the Pathfinder tool away from everyone else because these are things I use often. So now I have the gradient for my text set up in a way that I like. Like this is good for me. So the first thing I want to do is I want to give this thing a little bit of drama. Wolf, it's normally like maybe dark reds or blacks or something like that. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to drop red swatch. I'm just going to drag it and drop it right over top of the black swatch, right? And I'm going to take the lighter red and I'm going to drag and drop it over the white swatch. So you can start to see what's happening here, right? I've got dark and I've got light. I'm actually going to double click on the dark swatch and I'm going to make it even darker. So I'm going to pinch this thing down and you're going to notice the drama that's starting to happen inside my letter form, dark to light. I'm going to double click on light. I'm going to actually start to add a little bit of color shift to this. So look what's happening here. I'm already starting to get some really dramatic changes here, right? I'm getting some dramatic changes here, but I also can go to my gradient tool and look what's happening here. I can get in here. Here it is. Here's my thing. I can get in here and adjust my gradient. So I'm going to just rotate this thing a little bit. I'm going to shift it just so that you can see what's happening from a dramatic standpoint. And look how I drag this thing in and out. I'm still in a 2D world, but look at the difference that effect has to that effect. So think about this thing layered and layered and layered from a 2D illustration, and I adjust my gradients inside of my flat two-dimensional shapes to create drama. So I'm going to do that just to give it a little bit of personality to start with. And now I'm going to take my W, hold down shift, and I'm going to scale it up. And the reason I'm scaling it up is because I want to show you what you can do now when you have separate elements, the ones I need unified, the ones I don't. So look, if I rotate this way, look at the personality of that versus rotating it the other way. So I'm just showing you visually what happens dramatic wise based on the elements I'm making. So I'm actually going to make this thing as an arch because I want to show you what happens when you take an arch and you either apply it to a shape or you add an effect to the arch, because I'm only doing it with type so you can see what happens with effects and in a minute textures and things that you can do even with just typography to create three-dimensional space drama in a two-dimensional shape. Okay, so I have this shape and the original orange I have selected. I'm going to go in here and let's go back here, and this is my gradient. So here it is. I'm going to double click on this, and I'm going to take this, and let's go in. Let's see my, it's 87,100, 0, 87,100, 0. So I'm going to go in here and do this, and I'm going to do 0, 87, 100, 0. And I'm going to make my W the same color as my O, because I'm going to start manipulating and playing around with. I'm also going to make this color a swatch. So I'm just going to take it from my swatch foreground color, and I'm going to drag it over and add it down here. So I have my own orange swatch. I just want to make sure I have that as I do different things. Now, if I took that W and I decided I wanted to unite it, now look what happened. It merged this and it re-spread out the gradient. So now I got to go back in here, and maybe I want this thing to go back to the way it was. So I'm bringing that color back in. If I wanted to, I could go in here and add another color to my gradient by clicking right there. And maybe I want to drop in a lighter color, just so that you can see there's a lot you can do shading wise inside the gradient palette using unified shapes, separated shapes, overlapping, and things like that. So now we're starting to get this idea of a customized letter form, what you need to do in digital illustration. Now, we can also go in, and your book shows this in a different way, but you can use direct select and start manipulating the bowls inside your letter form. So for me, I start doing things like this. When I'm doing custom illustration work, I'll actually go in and I'll manipulate the letter forms to fit whatever I'm trying to do in my illustrations. You'll see it here. And sometimes I'll do weird things like little waves and little hooks and little counters. So you can see this is more like a comma now with a little bubble here. Sometimes I'll go in and I'll make the counters or the bowls bigger. So I'll go in here and modify my typography. So I'm going to hold down Shift, and I'm going to select these things. And then I'm going to hold down Shift and make this thing bigger. So I'm going to make it bigger, and then I'm going to move it. But remember, it's still all part of the shape that I created. All I'm doing is direct selecting the shape and manipulating it. So look what I'm doing here. And watch what happens when I overlap the shape. So look what happens when I overlap the shape. It's all part of a unified thing, but now I get this weird cutout. So now if I zoom out, look at that little teardrop I get inside of that shape. It's all something I can play around with later. Maybe if this was wolf, I could make that a blood drop inside of my bowl because I unified the letters, I outlined them, and I started manipulating the shapes a little bit. So just know typography is no different than the book showing you floral shapes that you're using direct select and manipulating. Now, when you manipulate type and make it an individual shape, so I've made it like this now, so you can see what I've done here. It's all a grouped object because I united it with my Pathfinder tool, so they aren't individual shapes anymore. But once I do that, the sky is the limit for things that I could do with the letters. So let me zoom this out a little bit so you can see one of two things. I'll actually make a copy of it and move it over there because there's some different things I want to do with it. So I'm going to select the first version, and I'm going to go in and simple things like a wave. And watch what happens as I crank this thing up. I've already manipulated the letters, right? I've already manipulated the letters. So look at the drama I can create from an effect standpoint. Once the type's a shape, once I apply some gradient or textural effect to it, and I start to manipulate it, because now it's outlined, I can do any kind of effect I want. So I'm just going to play around for a minute, just so that you can see the different things that are happening, because there might be some things that are a little bit better than other things. I'm actually think I'm going to do some kind of arch here. So you can see that I'm starting to get this squished, curved, dramatic thing happening. So that's really important. I want this kind of dramatic thing to happen so that I can start getting some personality to this thing. So we'll go ahead and vertically arch that 33%. Now, when I do outlines, gradients, effects, that sort of thing on typography, because now it's a shape just like an illustration of an object, I'll go in and do some effect manipulation. When I do effect manipulation, I start changing the shape of things. When I'm happy with the shape, I expand the appearance. Now, you'll notice when I zoom in that this thing has a green outline and the object itself, which means you can actually see the effect that has been applied to this shape, right? You can actually see the effect that's been applied to this thing, which actually is in the properties menu. So if I ever wanted to go in and change this thing some more, I can, right? Because all it is an effect applied to an object. Now, you need to freeze that thing or expand it when you create it as a finished piece of art, because if you give it to a sign company, a t-shirt company, someone that's producing this thing for a vehicle graphic, anything, they may not have those effects, those applications. So you want to make sure you make this thing a vector shape after you apply the effects so that they could open it as a PDF, a PNG, whatever they need to do. It separates the effect, but it gives you the finished product so they would see it the same way you created it. So once you do any kind of effects, you want to make sure you expand the appearance. That means that that green line snaps to the shape. Why is that important? The effect's been applied. It's now frozen into the shape, pathfindered into the shape, and then we can do other stuff with it. It's way easier to apply effect upon effect upon effect to an object if you expand each effect as you apply one thing to the other. So now maybe I like that, but I'm like, you know what? I think I want to get in here and I want to do a dry brush. And so I'm going to crank up the texture. I'm going to crank up the size. I'm going to start manipulating this thing a bit. I'm going to crank up the details. Maybe I'll crank down the brush size so you can start to see the edge of this thing has a little pixelation. Maybe colored pencil is a little bit better for me. The trick with colored pencil is it starts to do shading. So see how this thing starts to get highlighted based on the thing that I have selected. You've got all kinds of little textures here. You've got pastels, which a lot of people like. People like underpainting too, because you get this glow effect. So let's do pastels just so you can see what's going on. So if I crank up those, crank up the details on them, maybe crank up the scale, you can really start to see what is going on here. Crank up the relief, you get a lot of black and white from it. So I'm going to click OK. And now look at what's happening here. You've got a two-dimensional fill shape that's starting to get some really funky texture to it. But I already did my arch. I manipulated my letters. I took my direct select and started playing with them. Now you can start to see the textural drama that's happening with this object just by me doing things one at a time, expanding them, applying effects to them, simple gradients, simple textures. Let's see what expand does. Oh, look at this thing now. It removed the texture from it, the effect, and made it an object. Very good. This is really important now because now I don't have to worry about the effect. But let's just see what happens if I didn't do that. So I'm going to go back to the effect the way it was, right? Remember that the properties window will have the list of your effects on it. So let's see what starts happening if I start applying more than one effect. So we'll crank down the opacity. So let's go like 35%. Let's crank up the offset. So we'll go up to, let's go up to 10. Let's go to like 10 here. And let's go to like hardly any blur, just so that you can see two-dimensional versus three-dimensional approach to effects shadowing, stylizing. I'm going to do a happy medium, which is something in the middle, just so that you can see what's happening here from an effect standpoint. And I'm doing this with type first, so you can see the application of it when it goes to a shape, a character, a cartoon, because sometimes it's easier to see this thing from a type standpoint. So let's go down to like 5 for my blur. I want to do something enough of an offset so you can really see what's going on here. And now you'll see that I have 2, and this is something you got to be aware of, right? In my appearance tab, I now have 2 effects. Sometimes students get a little wrapped up with the fact, oh, I'm going to go back and do another drop shadow. And it's going to ask you, oh my gosh, you already have one. Do you want to apply another? Do not apply 2 of the same effects on top of each other inside one object. A, they're going to compete with each other. And B, you're going to get into a situation where you're stacking things on top of each other. So the one on top's overriding the one on the bottom, and your file is going to get really big. So just see what we're doing now as far as stacking one appearance at a time. They're different effects inside the same environment, so we can start getting that drama. A little trick I'll show you is that oftentimes I'll copy that thing and I'll paste in place the object on top of it. And watch what happens. It immediately becomes heavier saturation. You don't need to apply 2 shadows. You can actually paste in place one object on top of each other, and it'll give you the enhanced saturation that you want. Difference of the shadows based on just layering objects on top of each other. Now we're still in a 2D world. We're still just exploring textures, just to give you kind of an idea of how things work inside of this world. I could take this, copy and paste it, and I'm going to move it off to the side just so you can see what happens here. I'm going to go into my appearance tab. I'm going to actually click on this particular appearance effect and trash it. I'm going to trash my shadow, and I'm going to take my gradient, right? And I'm going to move it to the stroke. So I'm going to move the gradient to the stroke and remove that gradient from the fill. So look what's happening here. And I'm going to go in, and I'm just kind of in baby steps. I'm showing you type first, so you can see how it would apply to a 2-dimensional illustration if we were to take this one step further. And so recently, you've been able to apply gradients to strokes, which have become this really amazing thing. So take a look at this thing. So now I'm just going to park it on top of itself, and you'll notice that I moved the stroke to the outside. So you still get that body of it. So now look what happens if I take my gradient. I'm going to move it over here. I'm going to hide this, and I'll get back to my stroke palette, because I can actually go in here and drag a black, drag a light shade, and drag like a middle shade into here. And I'm going to go ahead and move that over. And now I'm going to minimize my stroke, just so that you could see drama that you can create from a stroke environment that's different. So look at the 3-dimensional space and how different it is with a white outline and a shadow than it is to black with a black outline and a shadow. So I'm starting to create kind of this 3-dimensional space in a 2-dimensional world. And just for the sake of the process, I'm going to go ahead and group this now, so it's all one individual object. That's way I know in my layers palette that I have this thing as a grouped object over here. So there it is. In here is a grouped object. So now I can zoom out a little bit, and you'll notice I had still my original shape here, because I just wanted to do some different things so you can kind of see what happens when you apply things in kind of a different technique. So here's my straight up type the way I had it before. And now I'm going to go in here, and I think I'm going to do, so let's go in and let's do maybe pucker. So look what's happening with pucker from an illustration standpoint. This thing doesn't even look like wolf anymore, right? So people are always trying to figure out, well, what can I do to unify my illustration? I don't know how to draw. I need a background shape in order to layer, to create some drama in my illustration. My goodness, you can type words, outline them, and do weird effects to them and create these crazy shapes out of it. So watch what happens now if I expand the appearance. Now watch what happens if I direct select some of this stuff. I mean, now watch. What if this was a wolf illustration and I took it and I put it behind my, I mean, there's so many possibilities if you understand shapes inside of a digital world. So if I just take this now, just for the sake of the process, let's go in here and I'll minimize this stuff. Let me get back to my gradient palette. I'm actually going to pull it off for a second. And now, just like I did with the outline, let's go into my swatch library. And just for the sake of the process, and I know you would have to be colorblind to do this, but I'm going to go in and grab 3 different shades of green and drop them into my object. And let's move that out of the way for a minute, because now I have this thing that I can move in. And look what I'm starting to do. Like when you go down the food store aisle and you look at all these complex illustrations for cereal boxes, and you name it, any kind of kids bursted candy thing that they throw in their lunchbox, and you're like, my gosh, look at all those shapes, look at the background textures, look at all the things they're doing that I wish I could do. Well, honestly, if you know basic shapes and you explore the vector palette of effects, you can create all kinds of unique things and have very little drawing ability. You can actually manipulate shapes and create all kinds of complex layered environments, just stretching, bloating, squishing, fish-eyeing, expanding, gradient, textures, that sort of thing, and create some really dramatic effects. And I'm just doing this with type so that you can kind of see what is going on here. But the last thing I want to show you from a textual standpoint before we get into our character illustration is that you don't even need to know how to do a lot of things in order to create some really funky things. So I'm just going to type in, the word girl. And I'm going to take this, I'm going to blow it up because, right, this is a girl here. So I want to start doing some funky things so that I can put a graphic kind of behind her. I'm actually going to move one of them over here and we're going to start playing with it just so you can see how it works. I'm going to take the word girl, just for the sake of the process. I'm going to outline it. I'm going to deselect this or ungroup it. I'm going to take the G, I'm going to hold down shift and I'm going to blow this thing up just because I want to create something kind of funky wise. So let me make sure I can still see the G and the I, but kind of give this a little personality. So I'm going to move that like that. I'm going to select this and I'm going to unify the shape. And now I'm going to take her hair here. So I'm going to copy and paste it and I'm going to move it over here and I'm going to join this thing into one shape. And I'm going to move this thing to the front. So I'm going to bring it to the front. And so now I have this big shape and I have the word girl and I'm going to select those two things, but actually I'm going to make the girl type the same color as the hair type. And so this is a vector drawing. I mean, I created this hair shape. I'm going to take this thing now. I'm going to select these two things and I'm going to go in and do an envelope apply. So let's do, it wants me to do a simple shape. So I'm going to take this thing. So let's zoom in and just for a quick pen tool process, because I normally do this with a shape that's closed, not a ponytail like this that has a little open shape to it. So I'm going to take this thing, kind of draw this basic ponytail shape here. And here's my thing. I'm going to bring that thing to front and I'm going to select these two things and I'm going to apply an envelope wrap to this. And and get this type. So let's make sure that this thing is how I want it to be. So let's make sure it's merged. Let's make sure this thing is a compound path. So there's a couple of things when you start getting into these like complex shapes that it wants you to solidify them in order to make objects out of them. So I'm just kind of playing around with this thing a little bit. So let's zoom out. It's not loving my ligature here because I have a compound path with this little shape that's lingering out here because that thing is its own thing. So let's just, for the sake of the process, I do these a lot of different ways. Sometimes I do the color treatment and all the things I'm doing to it before I apply the wrap or the envelope to it. And then after I apply the envelope to it, I'll go in and manipulate the shapes after I apply those things. So let's figure out why this thing isn't liking my ponytail. So let's make sure it's in the front. Let's outline this thing just to make sure that this thing remains in the front. I might have it on different layers, and so it's not liking my different layers. So let's see what's going on here. So let's select this and select this. And then if this doesn't like what I'm doing, I'm going to put them on its own layers so that I can get this thing. Yeah, it doesn't like the fact that we're on individual layers here. I never had any problem with this before, but just for the sake of the process, let's add a new layer. And I'm going to take this and copy it. I'm going to delete it. And I'm actually going to lock these layers, and I'm going to come over here and I'm going to add a new artboard. I'm just playing around. I want to show you some different techniques and different tricks and things that I do. So let's make sure that this thing will apply itself. It does kind of a funky thing. So let's see what we have going on here. Why does it not like this thing? Is this thing closed? Let me just see what's going on here. So I'm going to draw a quick circle and see if this thing is going to apply itself. Yeah, it doesn't like this shape. I must have a disjointed mark there, like my points are completely connected. But take a look at this envelope. It allowed me to put my shape, my text inside this shape, right? So look at this. And now when I zoom in, I have this thing as a text inside of a shape that's applying its attributes to that shape. So sometimes in my illustration, I'll actually go in and take the bottom of the shoes and write the girl's name inside the bottom of the shoes and delete the shape of the shoes and just have her name create the shape of the shoes. So it'll say like, if this girl's name was like Betty Smith, I would write Betty in the sole of this, Smith in the sole of this, delete these two shapes, and I would have her name creating the shoes. So I can outline and warp and apply all these effects, or I can just put the text inside of a shape and squish and play around with it. And it allows me to create this shape. And once the text is inside the shape, look what I can do. I can expand it and it makes it its own thing. The shape is no longer there. It's just the text. I can combine this thing and make it one shape. So I can use shapes, put words inside of shapes, and they can be simple shapes, circles, squares, triangles, very simple things. And I can squish, expand, convert this thing and give it its own kind of personality. And I have to have no digital illustration experience whatsoever. So let me copy this. I'm going to go into my layers. I'm going to go in and unlock my other layers so that now I can bring this thing. And I'm going to bring one of the girls. So let's bring the girl with the blue hair. I'm going to copy her and move her over because I'm going to start making an illustration now. So I'm going to paste her, and I'm actually going to put her on layer number 4. And I'm going to name this, just for the sake of the process, book cover, because I want to paste this on the book cover layer. And I'm going to make her big. And I'm going to take the word girl now, and you're going to see what I'm doing really quickly. So I'm going to take her, let's move girl up towards the top. Let's move her down. And so now I'm just going to start playing around with her. I'm going to rotate her a little bit. Maybe I'm going to scale her down, and I'm going to start now playing around with this girl to make this the beginning of my book cover. I can actually go in here now. Let's unlock these other layers. I'm going to grab my splash that I created. I'm going to lock that and lock that. And I'm going to go on this layer. And who would have known? Only you would know. And you could tell all your friends, you know, that really funky shape I made in the background on my book cover, that actually says the word wolf. I just converted it crazy so that it became this splash effect inside of my book cover. So let's go in here and zoom around a little bit. So now this is where I need to, and I'm going to actually go into my layers here, and let's make sure that I have this selected. So let's find that shape in my selection. It's right here. So I'm going to lock it. I'm going to find my girl text, right? So let's find the girl text. And remember, it's labeled by a little dot there. So I'm going to lock that because those two things I'm happy with. So now I can go in and select this. I can group it. So see, now it's grouped and it's moved to the front. I'm just organizing my things here so you can kind of see how I think in my brain. So I have this. Now I'm going to zoom in. And remember, we're in a 2D world, and I'm going to direct select the face using my direct select, because remember, we grouped it and we layered it last week. We did an outline layer, and then we had our objects stacked on top of each other. Now I'm going to start doing what I did with type, but I'm going to start doing it in a 2D illustration world, so you can start to see how my brain thinks when I'm taking something flat, and I want to keep it two-dimensional, but I want to start bringing some personality to it. So the very first thing I do inside my drawing, when I have shapes filled, I try to keep my fills underneath my strokes, right? My black and white pen line, and then my colored shapes under it. That way I know I can always have a solid outline if I want, and I can detail the shapes inside of it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'm going to drag that color and start manipulating my gradient, right? Here's my gradient right here. So I'm going to start doing skin tones and different things with my face, so you can start to see how I think when I'm doing. So right now we already know that it would be darker here and lighter here, right? Darker here and lighter here. So I'm going to start pivoting this thing. And now you're going to start seeing. So I'm going to start moving this a little bit. I'm going to start pinching this in a little bit. I'm actually going to pinch this in a little bit. And this is my slider range. So I'm going to start playing around with the slider. And I think I'm going to add this color towards the end of my gradient. So I got to take that swatch and I got to drag it and drop it over here. Actually, it's easier sometimes just to do it inside of my gradient thing. So let's just drop this thing over there. And I'm going to pinch this thing out a little bit, pinch this out a little bit, and start dragging this thing to get a little drama in how all of this thing is interacting. I'm going to take this swatch and I'm going to drag the darker one and drop it over here. And now you can start to see, I'm going to pinch. The more separation I have, right? The more separation I have, the more dramatic of a mark I have. So I'm going to start doing this in a way that creates a little bit of a highlight of the lips. And I actually just want to drag this off just a skosh and move this over just a skosh and start playing around with, and I'm going to move this because I want to soften the gradient in the front and soften the gradient in the back. So take a look at this, and I'm actually going to hide the outline so you could start to see what I have going on here. I've got this dark shape happening, and I have this gradient of highlight happening inside of there. So the next thing I want to do is I want to add some texture to this face so I can start giving this thing some personality. So I'm going to move this out of the way. I'm going to direct select this kind of complex gradient that I have going on. And notice I can do it in different ways, right? I can do it in different ways to apply different things to the face, whether it be kind of this more jagged, this linear, or this radial. It kind of depends on the kind of technique I have going, but you can see the dramatic kind of highlight I have going on based on what I'm doing. I pinch this in again. So take a look at what I'm doing. I mean, I really can create some very interesting highlights in the face right here based on what I'm doing. Some light shining, some shimmer. If I didn't want to do it in the gradient, I can drag that swatch off, and I'm actually going to show you how I can do it using my shape tool. So I'm going to build some drama back into this thing, start pinching this further back, drag this over. So you can see I'm getting a little highlight here, getting a little darkness here. So I'm happy with how that kind of thing is looking. I'm going to go in now because I like to do things like kind of like a crackle effect inside of the face. So you can immediately see the drama of this. A really cool way to do some very subtle texture is to start getting in and playing around with paper texture in a two-dimensional world. And you see this a lot in Nickelodeon world. You see a lot of it in cereal boxes where they start bringing to life vampires and cartoons and tigers and different things on the kids aisle of snacks and candies and different things like that. They're using Illustrator, they're using gradient techniques to build kind of this dramatic thing. And then they're applying different surface textures to each individual shape in order to start getting this kind of dramatic effect. So, all right, so I went in, I started to build some three-dimensional shape using gradient techniques. I'm starting to use some effects palettes to start applying some textures. Now, the third thing I start to do in a two-dimensional world is start doing some light highlights, some texture highlights inside of my illustration. So here's my face here. I'm actually going to use my pen tool just so you can get an idea of kind of how I do it. So I'm going to go in here with my pen tool, and I'm going to create a very basic shape around the jawline of this character. I'm still just dealing with two-dimensional shapes. We'll deal with portraits and realism next week, but I want to get in here and show you some of the very simple things I do. If you start visualizing in shapes, that you can create some really cool things. So this thing is starting to follow what would be the cheek or cheekbone line and kind of that chin area of things. And I like to do is I like to go in here and apply blurs to my overlay shape. So look what's happening and I'm going to do it less dramatic so you can see a two-dimensional shape and how it would affect. So let me just do this first. I'm just going to do a very simple shadow for two-dimensional space. And then once I do that, I'm going to go into my properties window and I'm going to crank this down quite a bit. And you're going to see that this just becomes a highlight in the cheekbone area, right? Still two-dimensional shape. We'll worry about portraits and the complexity of glows and bone structure and all that. But I just want you to see the difference. So watch what happens. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to make it, I don't know, about maybe 40% or so. So you can get the beginning of the cheek line. And remember, this is a blur, so I can just kind of move this thing around. So I'm actually going to move this, find a happy little spot that I think is interesting. So I'm going to drop that in there, and I'm going to copy and paste this object, and I'm going to drop it right on top. And look at what happens where it overlaps the other shape. Really important to know. So let me click on that, and I'm going to adjust the saturation of this thing now. And I'm going to take my direct select tool, and I'm only using one shape. So I'm just telling you right now, I'm not great at drawing. So I'm just going to move this thing and overlap it a little bit so you can start to see what's happening inside of my shading. So I'm going to zoom in on here, and you can actually see the overlap, right? So you can see where it's darker versus where it's lighter. It's actually starting to get a little bit of a glow. And so I'm going to shrink this a little bit. And now you can really see the light shape and the dark shape and how it's overlapping. Now I'm just playing around a little bit so you can get the gist of, you're going to really quickly start to see how you don't have to know how to draw a whole lot. And you can start to get some very interesting three-dimensional space inside of a two-dimensional space. Now you're going to see the darkness of the overlap right there, and it's slightly lighter above the overlap. Maybe I don't love that. Maybe I want this thing not to have too much of the overlap because there shouldn't be a really dark jawline there. So let me move it out of the way so you can see it. And then I'm going to drop it back over. And then I'm going to change my opacity and make it a little bit darker. And now when I zoom out, you can really see the difference of the shadowing of the jawline and the lighter shadow of the neckline. So now, just for the sake of the process, look at when I zoom out. You would have no idea all the effects and the shapes and the things I've done to apply to this. You'll actually notice it's slightly lighter there. So maybe I want to pinch it up just a skosh to get rid of that light highlight. So now you can see it. So now let's apply that thing to lips. I'm still doing it in a two-dimensional shape. I'm just trying to build baby steps with textures, shapes, and effects so you can see the life of its own that your illustration can make just with simple understanding. Basic pen tool. You could go to Vecteezy and download a basic girl and make it your own very quickly using this technique. Picture of a hot dog in a bun. You can caricature that thing, modify with direct select, apply textures, gradients, overlapped objects, do different things and make it your own very easily. So now the lips, I know probably, so I'm just doing a basic shape. So I'm just doing a basic shape so you get the idea of what I'm trying to accomplish here, right? So I'm going to shrink that down. Here's my shape. Let's minimize that for just a second. And we know probably the lips have some shade of a red quality to them. Oh man, so let's zoom out for a minute. That's way too harsh. Maybe it isn't. Maybe I was looking to do something like that. But from an effect standpoint, so let's just nudge that up a little bit. So watch what I'm going to do. So I'm going to go back in, right? And we're playing around with blurs. So let's crank it down just a skosh. Let's move that thing up a little bit. And now let's zoom out and you can start to see the highlight, right? And we're doing the exact, I'm not doing anything miraculous here. I want to show you that simple shapes applied to simple illustrations. So let's take this and let's go into appearance. Let's see what we have going on here. We'll double click on our color saturation. Let's make it a little bit darker. I'm not changing the opacity this time. I'm just changing the shade. Because if I change the opacity, I'm going to get that bleed through where some things look overlapped and darker than others. So you're going to quickly see as I make this thing a little bit tighter, I'm going to go into the properties window. I'm going to go into blur. I'm going to crank it down a little bit so it gets really dark, right? So this is the brain trying to figure out how I want this thing to look. And now you're seeing that I'm starting to get some shapes. Now, what happens if I just take that shape and copy and paste it and object transform, reflect it, and I want to reflect it horizontally and click OK. And I'm going to start messing around with this thing just so that you can see that I did it once. And now I've created the pucker of the lips, right? This is not complicated shapes. You don't have to know a lot about the pen tool. I could have taken a photograph of a monkey, traced it into simple shapes so that I could see the shapes of the body, the ears, the basic things, and then applied colors, created an outline layer, took those colors and applied some subtle gradients, took the gradients and applied textures, copied the texture of the shape, pasted it in place and made the shape slightly smaller. And I could make all the shapes inside the face from the one shape I created of the face. It's really crazy how simple illustration techniques can turn into something really dramatic. So let's just do that one more time with the ear so you can see dark traits, how things work. So I already did this once and I like the way it looks, right? Copy, paste. Let's bring it over. Let's, with our selection tool, just squish this thing. We'll rotate it. I'll squish it a little bit more. I'll take my direct select tool, move this to the outer edge of the ear. You know, all I'm doing is bowing this thing so you can see the complexity of the shape. Let's select this one. We'll bow it out. We'll bring this, pinch it out a little bit. I'm going to flatten it so it looks a little bit smoother, right? Move it down here. Select this. Bow it out a little bit. That one's a direct point, so I don't have access to any real bowing there. So let's drag this one here. Here it is, right? So I can realign it. I've only drawn the shape once. Let's go into our properties. So let's figure out what we got going on here. We got the blur going. We got the opacity. So let's crank up the opacity. Maybe we want it 100%, so it's really blending in there. Let's take a look at our color. We can drag it from its shade a little bit so it's much more kind of saturated and dark. So now you can see the ear is a lot darker than the face, which is good because maybe this is really dramatic because it's tucked behind her hair a little bit, right? I'm going to take this, copy and paste it. So here's my shape. Let's go in and let's lighten that color back up to there. So here it is. Use the direct select, pinch it down a little bit. Use this direct select, pinch it a little bit. I'm going to grab this little handle and I'm going to make it a really light highlight. So if you know anything about anatomy, the ear kind of has that double fold there, right? So I have that thing going on. Okay. All right. So now I'm doing shadowing. All it is textures, simple gradients, subtle blurs, but I'm deciding now, I think that the eyelid, because it's lighter here, right? It's lighter here. I want this eyelid to be really bright, like the light is shining there and it's really having an effect on the eyelid. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to do it two ways. The first way, I'm just going to do a shape. I'm just going to do a shape for the eyelid, right? We've already kind of seen how this works. I'm just going to fill it in white, right? So you can already see the dramatic shape of this thing, right? And for some artists, when they're working, you know, that's what they want. They want that bright fill shape, right? But we're already talking about this blur effect, right? So I'm just showing you some simple techniques. And so let's crank it down a little bit. And so here it is. Right, so we're doing more of a realistic technique here. And once I have that applied, remember, we have direct select as our friend. So maybe I want to move this down here. I'm going to use the space bar so I can grab my handle a little bit easier. I'm going to stretch this thing out, maybe not that much. Let's grab this down a little bit. It's like right there. All right, I'm going to select this one. I'm going to pinch it out a little bit. I want to get it to the top of the eye a little bit more. All right, so let's pan this. And then let's see what we got going on here. We'll select this one. That might be a little too far. So let's get this, grab this handle. And let's take that like that. Just dragging this a little bit, right? So there's the highlight to my eye to start getting the drama of the light. I could do the same thing here on the top of the nose if I wanted that to highlight. So I could take this shape, create a shape out of this thing. So let's zoom in a little bit. So I'm going to click on that and I'm going to use my eyedropper and select that to make sure it's pure white. and apply my blur to it. And now you're starting to see it's all style, but it's just different way artists do different things for positive and negative space, kind of building the depth of that feeling. I don't know if you've ever used the line segment tool before, but I could have done this same technique with the line segment tool. Watch if I do this line and I curve it, right? So here it is curved. And we're going to go in here and I'm going to apply a width tool to this line. So I'm going to make it thick by pinching out in the center of the shape. So you see that? So let's undo that for a second so you can see this line. I'm actually just going to move it out of the way for a second. I drew that as a shape because that's how my brain sees things. My brain sees things as clusters of shapes, but you can also do it by just seeing it as lines and making the line taper. So you see how that line tapers? It does the exact same thing this thing did by creating a shape. I just did it with a line segment tool, with the pen tool and changing the width of that. Now, if I do it this way, I need to make that thing a shape, right? So it was a stroke that I made a shape. Now, I can apply the same thing I did with my shape. And some would argue that's a better shape because I did it with the pen tool. I tapered the width. And so I know it's the shape of the eye. You can also do that with, so if you spent the time to really outline this thing, I could go in here and I'm going to just use the direct select tool and hold down shift. And I'm going to select just this part of the line. So I'm going to select just that part of the line and do copy paste. And look, here it is. So I just direct selected that part. I spent the time to trace it. So why would I go in and retrace all of these lip shapes? All right, so I don't need this line. So I'm going to direct select that. Oh, I don't need really this line. So I'm going to direct select that. And I'm just going to leave with the parts I need, which is the basic shape of the lips, right? So now I have this thing as the basic shapes of the lips. I can expand those shapes. So there they are. I can unify those shapes. Now they're all one. I'm doing the same steps over and over again, just showing you different applications. And look what happens if I make it white, just for the sake of the process. I'm going to make it white. And I'm going to apply my effects to it. So let's see, let's do, I don't know, like some kind of blur. And I'm going to zoom in just so that you can see, you can take the same shapes and kind of just squish them in a little bit. So I'm just going to squish them in a little bit. And I'm going to use direct select now that I have this shape as my own shape. I'm just holding down shift just so that you can see what I'm doing. Right? It's just thinking outside the box a little bit. Just thinking outside the box a little bit. And I can do it one line at one point at a time if I really wanted to. And it doesn't look like much now, but watch when I move this thing. And I'm just going to quickly do it. I would spend more time making this a perfect shape, but I just want to give you the idea of what's going on here. So let's just get this thing at least pinched in, so it's not so much overlapping that thing. And so now when I zoom out, you can start to see the three-dimensionalness of the pucker that's starting to happen. And maybe, just maybe, let's move this out of the way for a second, because I'm going to take this, hold down shift, take that, hold down shift, take that, hold down shift, take that. And I'm going to do object arrange, bring to front, just so that it's in front of this quirky little shape I was making. So now, look what happens. It just highlights the top of the lip, starts to highlight where light might be hitting the lips, still two-dimensional, still flat, but we're just starting to play with some of the attributes. And now I can just quickly, I'm going to do this quickly because I'm at an hour-and-a-half lecture. I want to kind of get you guys so that you can play a little bit. So I'm just going to go in here and only select the shoes, the skirt. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to do the same crackle texture. It's already preset because that's what I did. And I try to stay in the same presets. I don't try to do different crackles for different parts of the texture. And so now when I zoom in, you can kind of see the lips. You can see the beginning of the body. You can see the shoes, how fun they are. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to direct select my arm. I'm going to direct select the leg, and I'm going to direct select this leg. I'm going to use my eyedroppers and sample the face. And look what happens. It took my gradient that I'd already applied, right? And it applied it to the other parts of the body. So that's a really good starting point. I at least have some basic things going. Actually, here it works out well. It's dark there and it's light here, like it might if it was going to. And so now I can direct select this, and let's see what we have going on from a pivot standpoint. So we might have to, I think, rotate this thing around and move the arm like that. So let's do a little bit of that. And you can quickly see what we have going on here. I mean, not a lot of work, but a whole lot of progress that's happening on. So, and last but not least, we could go in here and we have all these things going, right? But it's grouped. We can add a shadow to the whole thing. We can add an outer glow to the, so not only are there effects to each individual object, there's an effect applied to the entire grouped shape. Now you have three-dimensionality in a two-dimensional space, and each individual object inside of the two-dimensional space has its own effects, its layered objects, and its textures. You start doing that, and you can get some really funky things going on. What if I selected just that and I applied the drop shadow? So not only is there a drop shadow on the grouped object, but you can see there's a shadow on the hair by itself, which gives you this. So now we got something really going on here. So let's zoom into the shoes and let's do that again, just so that you can see this process. So now select and select. And the shoes have a double shadow, a shadow on the group and a shadow in the individual shape. Now you're starting to get a lot of separation from the space. Some people love this. Some people like exploring three-dimensionality in a two-dimensional space. Like it's, you know, what gets them going. Some like to keep the shapes flatter. If I wanted to, I could do the same techniques, the same shapes, right? And look at the difference of the style, just totally different style, same thought process, same visualizing of shapes, just a different technique to it. Lips are all blurred, all sculpted, all shaped in a two-dimensional space, much harsher here. Next week, we're going to take this one step further and start pushing the envelope of realism in a two-dimensional space. Really start sculpting a portrait of a face, doing a lot of these techniques, but understanding cheekbones, layers of hair, all the things that are involved in a two-dimensional space in order to create a three-dimensional digital painting is what they call it. And there's samples all over the place for that. So that's what we're going to do next week. So we're at an hour and a half lecture. I want to try to keep it an hour and a half. So those of you watching it back later, get comfortable with the process. Remember, you have those 3 projects in chapter 3 and just 1 project, that skeleton with texture applied to it in chapter 4. That starts to give us that look, that technique of texture, and then your book cover. And you can do any style you want. It just has to be all vector. It needs to include typography, some text. That's why your book does that sketched outline where they manipulate with the pen tool and direct select, and how I did it, just doing a simple text block with an outline, and where you scale the letters and merge them together to make your own typography, your own unique typeface inside something that's already typed out. So that brings us kind of over chapters 3 and 4 and into the textual element of our out of book project. It's a lot of fun. I hope you enjoy it. I mean, gosh, we can do simple things like taking this thing and filling it in. You know, this one already had a pattern already applied to it. So that's why I'm just kind of showing you this. And then let's not make it that drastic, but maybe somewhere. So let's go stroke width. Let's do variation. Let's do spacing. And I'm just tweaking this a little bit so we can kind of see what we have going on here. So let's do that. Let's do a texture. I always like, let's do green. You're going to see like some really crazy things start happening here. Let's zoom out a little bit. So here's our grain. We'll crank up contrast. We'll crank up intensity. Let's, we'll keep it like that, but let's do like sprinkles. Click OK. And then we'll take this and let's expand appearance so we get this kind of thing going. Let's do blur. So I'm going to take this. I don't want it to blur that much because I want you to be able to see the texture that's created. It's taking a second to render. So I'm going to take this now and I'm going to, so let's do that. Let me move it out of the way for a minute because I want to show you something. We're just texturizing, just using a basic swirl and everything. I'm going to copy and paste this shape. And then I'm going to go in and trash the crackle. I'm going to fill it in basic, let's fill it in basic white, just so you get the idea of what I have going on here. So I'm going to take this and select this, and I'm going to clip that texture into that shape. Now watch what happens. I take this and I'm going to bring these objects to front just so that you get an idea of what I have going on. Let's hold down shift. So object, bring to front. I'm going to take this, I kind of move this over, and I'm going to take this. And then I'm going to change the opacity and crank it down a little bit. So let's get this. We'll select it. Let's crank the opacity down a little bit. And you start to get kind of an airbrush skin technique. Now I would have to bring these lines to front and bring these shapes to front so you can see them, but you can actually take a pattern, scribble the pattern, any pattern. I mean, you could draw circles, triangles, whatever, fill them with a color, drag them into the swatch area, which is all this was, this little thing right here, and fill it with a color, turn it into a swatch, dump it into a shape and scribble it, and then blur it. And it starts to create all kinds of a weird texture, create your own texture. I've gotten crazy sometimes, and I was doing an illustration one time, and I was doing kind of like a caricature, and I probably had 100 objects on top of each other, all different sizes, filled with all different textures and a slightly different shade of the same color with a different blur opacity. And it looked like this complicated cartoonish illustration, but I only drew the shape once. I drew the shape once. I filled it with like 50 different patterns. I changed the color of the pattern for each shape, and I changed the intensity of the blur. So it got tighter as it got lighter, and it got more expansive as it got darker, and it created this really shadowy thing that was going on. So your book has you play around with some of these techniques, some of these effects, but you can actually see it right there. Look at how weird it is. Like when you apply that to something, no one would have any idea that it was something that was created inside of Illustrator's patterns. I mean, it's really very funky. So, okay, gang, I went a little bit overboard there, got a little extra over the hour and a half, but let me stop the recording. Everyone knows what they have to do for this week. So play, practice the pen tool, start seeing how these things can be shapes, and the shapes can be filled, and the shapes that are filled can be gradients, and those gradients can have textures applied to them, and they can also be layered and blurred with brightness and darkness of color to create shape. You got to kind of practice that a little bit, because next week when we do portrait, we're sculpting eyes, noses, lips, hair, and it's all techniques that we're going to take one step further into what I would consider digital illustration advanced techniques. So I'll go ahead and stop the recording. I'll share the recording inside of the announcement section. All right, have a good night, everyone.